hear me okay? I know the acoustics here are pretty good. Great. How many students had parents that went to school here? See, look, my daughter's 7. I'm trying to convince her to come to class. She's tired. So, I graduated in 92 as a post-grad. Came here mostly for wrestling, but was surprised at what a great experience I had here. It was really a formative year for me. Learned from a lot of great professors like Marty Miller, kept in touch with over the years, and been back to school a few times since I left campus. So it's a great honor to be back here tonight to talk about this. So I'll talk for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and then we can get into some questions. The focus here is mostly, as Marty was saying, I was in the SEAL teams from 97 until 2012. And so most of you were probably a little tinier in 2001, but the events on 9/11 obviously rattled the U.S. across the board and the military in particular. At that point, I was about 4 years into my career, and we were, in our minds, in the special operations community and the SEAL teams in particular, of the mindset that we were ready to take on any challenge. And what we found was, a few years into the conflict, in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in other places around the world, that the way the world works has shifted. And that happened somewhere, I'd argue, in the 90s. We just sort of missed the boat. And we realized how badly we missed it somewhere around 2004, 2005, in Iraq in particular, where we were losing a major conflict. The U.S. was on the edge of losing the entire war, and the special operations community was right in the middle of that, because we had a very specialized job that required us to be able to deal with the hardest fighters inside of the Al-Qaeda network. If we as a nation and our allies couldn't hold back that part of the fight, then there was no way we were going to win the bigger engagement. And we weren't able to keep up with that threat, which was very eye-opening. You spend your whole life thinking you're part of the best team in the world, and suddenly you're getting defeated pretty handily by what seems like a much less capable opponent. It rattles you to the core. And so we had to redesign basically the way we operated, not at the team level, but as an organization, as an enterprise. And so part of this narrative is around those lessons of how and why organizations can deal with this shift that's taking place inside the world, because it's impacting everything from military to healthcare to education. I think you'll see sort of parallels across the board as we talk through this. So it starts with the idea of team. I mean, this is my own story, coming up in the SEAL teams. Obviously, a lot of people here, I'm sure, on great teams here at Blair. And so your mindset is this idea of, at the very core level, what are the small groups that you come up inside of, and you understand each other, like it's your left hand talking to your right hand. So I came up through Blair Wrestling. I mean, these were the greatest teams that I was ever involved with, were right here on this campus at a young age. And so that was the mentality I left here with, and said, okay, this is the type of things I want to be involved with for the rest of my life. And so I moved on to these types of teams, which are similar in their esprit de corps, and the competitive nature, and sort of the challenge of becoming part of something that's sort of specialized. It's got its own sort of rigorous entry procedure, much like the Blair Wrestling Room. This is sitting in the surf zone in San Diego in freezing cold water, or learning how to work with teams in various sort of difficult conditions. Any guesses why we do this to trainees? Just because it's absolutely horrible to sit in mud for 2 hours. There's no other reason. But it makes you pretty tough at the end. And then you get into slightly more advanced teams. You start doing fun stuff around the world. And the goal is to get onto these most elite teams that are out there. So even as a young trainee, there's this level of community inside the special operations world for us and SEAL teams or other military units that are just the most highly refined, specialized, small counterterrorism forces that the world's ever seen. And so that's what we entered into the fight with, as I was saying earlier. But by 2004, we had this sort of nightly cadence of these amazing teams going out on operations around the country, doing at the ground level what we thought was the most critical work, and we couldn't imagine how to do it any better or faster. But when we looked around us, the country was imploding. We were still losing on a grand scale. It was the most significant fight that our country had been in a generation. And we had a hard time figuring out how we got from our mentality of the 90s to this, which was on the precipice of total defeat. And so, if you remember, there were key leaders inside the Al-Qaeda world. Now you see this in ISIS. And this was sort of the mentality that the country had in the 90s, and it goes back many years back before that, where we're all sort of ingrained to look for these sorts of structures. You know, there's a problem out there. Someone's in charge of it. Who's the senior person that's running this force or this country or this school, whatever organization, because we're very westernized in our mindset of sort of top-down authoritarian view. This is what we look for. So for us, the way that manifested on the battlefield was, okay, we're fighting this thing. Someone's running it. So we need to find those people, and that's where the real center of gravity with this problem is. But in reality, these networks have evolved that take away the need for top-down leadership. And that was an epiphany that took us 2 or 3 years to even begin to comprehend, because it's a radically different shift. If you were born in the 70s or somewhere around there, the idea of sort of distributed networks is a different way of thinking about the world. Now, I'd argue your generation is probably much more attuned to that just because of the way you run your lives and you connect with much broader networks of people through digital platforms and just the way you communicate with your friends and family around the world. That shifted somewhere in the 90s when the information age really took over and we had this sort of fingertip ability to create these sort of networks. But if you have an 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s sort of mentality, this is a radically different sort of problem. And so for us, we were brought up in this group where we had these elite teams that are somewhere inside of that broader organization. And the way that would manifest on the battlefield was we would see, okay, we'd have these elite teams spread out. We'd say there's a threat over on this part of the country, let's move and fight it. And then now there's a threat here, here, and here. Let's move other small teams around. And so you keep trying to shift and get ahead of this problem, but it continues to grow and grow and expand. The problem is it's built much like a sort of a human brain in the way it thinks and acts, with individual nodes constantly connecting across boundaries. And if you're trying to put a centralized or top-down mentality against that, it's very difficult to ever get ahead of it, because it is by its very nature organic in the way that it reacts to the situations around it. And so we had to move from this idea of individual teams addressing the problems into this concept of these team of teams sort of approach to it, which is, we just produced a book on this, and that was the namesake of it. So let's go back a little bit now to the history of where this thinking comes from, and throughout the 20th century, and how that led into the military, the way the military evolved and was thinking when this problem started to really hit us in the face. Frederick Winslow Taylor, has anyone ever heard that name? All right. Father of the
time difference, broke everything down into component parts, every action in a component part of the time.
Exactly, yeah. So Frederick Winslow Taylor, sort of out of the Northeast, really bright guy, got accepted into Harvard right around the arrival of the industrial age, but decided to go into industry instead as a 20-year-old. And as a really bright young mind, looked at the way that the industrial revolution was impacting and manifesting inside of factories and whatnot, and was known for walking around with a stopwatch and timing every single detail. And he's really considered the father of the efficiency movement inside of U.S. industry. His concept was that if it takes 10 minutes to make a widget, I can get that down to 9 or 8 or 7 by reducing the number of movements that someone needs to make, by limiting the number of interactions between different parts of the assembly line so there's less variable in the output, all these sorts of things that we sort of take for granted. At this point in our evolution, back then it was very revolutionary, because you had this sort of artisan mentality of, I will produce this thing from start to finish on my own. And Taylor really shifted that entire idea for the country. So you end up with what we now consider the modern day assembly line, which is really where Taylor's genius came into play. This then carried over into the military. There's been a generational relationship between military and business going back many, many years, as far back as you want to trace sort of modern history, actually. And this sort of efficiency mentality allowed you to create and scale massive armies and move them with some sort of controlled chaos out on major battlefields. It allowed us to scale up huge armies, World War I and World War II, which were in many ways sort of industrial competitions. So World War II hits, and we have a relatively small army, but the US is able to use its industrial might and this sort of efficiency thinking to scale up an army and create supply chain and communications structures inside of that allow us to send an army over to Europe and ultimately win the war. But efficiency as a movement comes at a cost. And so this sort of mentality carried over into on the military side of thinking. Extending from World War II, really, is where the whole idea of this efficient top-down sort of siloed structures really came into play. And so the Joint Special Operations Command, which is where a lot of our narrative took place, that's a subset of the Special Operations community that includes a lot of those sort of elite Special Operations teams that you'll hear about doing activities around the world between Delta operators and SEAL Team 6 and these sort of forces that are out there a little bit in the news these days that you might have heard of. They have their roots going back to 1979. Does anybody remember what critical thing happened in 79 that would affect the military? Who said it? Yeah, that's right. So the Iranian hostages under the Carter administration, our embassy in Tehran was taken by Iranian activists and held for an extended period. And the U.S. military, specifically the Special Operations Community, was asked to react to that. And they planned what in today's world would be a relatively pedestrian sort of operation. You had to fly from the ocean, land in the desert, go into landed at a site that's called Desert One. So this mission is often referred to in history as the Desert One mission. It was actually Eagle Claw. They were going to fly in, drop off some operators, bring in resupply of fuel, then the next day move into Tehran, hit the embassy, rescue our hostages, and then take off. What happened was at the Desert One refuel site, because there were simple miscommunications between the different aircraft, a helicopter runs into a fixed-wing C-130. They explode, and we lose a bunch of operators in the mission. They never even get into Tehran, and it's this national embarrassment. This image is all over the news the next day. And so we look like this extremely incapable force. At the same time, at that period in history, other special operations units around the world, the British SAS, the Germans, the Israelis, are really starting to accelerate their capability and demonstrate to the world what highly effective special operations units can do. So on our end, because of the sort of efficiency structure, we convinced ourselves that we can take Navy helicopters, put Marine pilots inside of them, get aircraft cargo planes to land in the desert, use Army commandos, Delta operators, and Rangers were on the ground for this mission, and everything will go flawlessly. It didn't go flawlessly, it go horribly wrong, because radios couldn't even talk to each other, words meant different things between these different units, and you end up with this very, very preventable accident in the desert. And so the Joint Special Operations Command was created on top of that after a major investigation by Congress to look into why this had happened. And what they found was you're not really a collaborative organization. You have these highly specialized teams, but you have no connection between them. So they can't actually pull off this complex of a mission. And so they created, amongst other things, the Joint Special Operations Command. And they said, of all the military functions out there between Army and Navy, Air Force, etc., you all have these specialized pockets, but we want them to fall under one common headquarters. So JSOC was created after that investigation. And they said, okay, now you all have a relationship under this one joint commander. And so I spent most of my career here in the Navy side of this portion, but your peers with all these other different units from around different military structures. The problem was it became what it knew, which was this siloed hierarchy. So even on paper, it looked like now we have this joint thing that can really work as a collaborative team of teams across these boundaries. The way it evolved in reality was these red lines developed between the different groups, and you didn't really talk to each other. And so in '79, radios couldn't talk to each other. In 2001, on 9/11, email systems couldn't talk to each other. So we just recreated the same problem, only it manifested itself slightly differently. And then when you extend the problem up, if you look at sort of the global conflict against a thing like Al-Qaeda or other forces that are out there similarly designed, you had JSOC, but then you have all these other agencies that are similarly siloed and designed to be highly efficient verticals, reporting up to the President of the United States, and same sort of divisional problems develop between them. So these highly siloed but efficient organizations. So if you need to get information from this side over to that side, there's a known path. It's going to go up all the way through the president sometimes, back down onto this side, and they'll learn what they need to know. The problem is that can only move so fast. And when you're facing a distributed network, like the image on the right, that is nothing but highly adaptable in the way that it works, and trying to use an efficiency model to defeat it, you're going to lose every time. And so this was where we were in 2003, 2004, where we realized we've done 40 years worth of work perfecting this model over here, and we're still getting outmaneuvered by untrained, ill-equipped, what seems like sort of a ragtag band of folks. But the one thing they're doing well is connecting and passing information. And so I promise this is the only graph I'll put up here. But the idea here, and this is where I think your generation is probably going to be the most interesting one for us to watch for quite a while, is technology obviously is increasing at an exponential curve. I won't bore you with how different life was 20 years ago, but I'm sure your parents regale you with stories about it. Human behavior is always sort of trailing just behind technology advances. The issue is we haven't, as a world really, especially in the US, we haven't affected the organizational systems and processes that drive enterprises since the Industrial Revolution, really. A lot of the same stuff is taught, a lot of the same systems are in place that Frederick Winslow Taylor designed over 100 years ago. And that manifests in all different ways, and on the battlefield led to near defeat around the world for us. So we got to this idea, okay, we need to do one thing well immediately, which is adapt to the problem around us if we're going to face this problem. And so on the old system of running a global fight, what you would do is connect two headquarters, put one where the fight is and one back where the decision makers are in DC, say. Fill rooms on either side with senior leaders and decision makers. Allow them to get all the pertinent information that's going on the battlefield. And they'll create this sort of nice hierarchical structure on each end of the fight, pass information top down, bottom up, across the world. We have all the technology to allow us to do this, and everybody feels really good about what's happening because you've got all the senior people in two rooms keeping each other updated. But we realized after a while, this is just two rooms of people talking to each other and making each other feel good. But in reality, we're facing a distributed fight, and the information is not coming in fast enough to be able to truly affect what we're seeing on the ground. And so you have this gap between reality that people are seeing and feeling and what's actually being reported up to senior level decision makers. And so what we had to do was create not just this point-to-point connection between the senior folks, that's a critical part of how things need to continue to function, but also accept the fact that this is how the world actually passes information nowadays. And so we have to be able to incorporate these networks into our thinking and our communication flows, which is threatening and dangerous for a lot of folks, my generation and up, that came up inside of these traditional systems where you learn to be highly efficient as an employee or as a member of the military unit at each level, and that's how you tell the folks above you, I'm ready for the next level of command, the next level of command. And eventually you want to be that single dot, that four-star general, that dean, that whatever system you happen to be in, that top of the org chart, so to speak, person. And thinking like this breaks a lot of those rules because the person on this side of the network that we're creating is nowhere near being a senior leader. But what you're saying is, I need to hear from you and get your opinion on this issue in near real time. So you have to break through all these traditional boundaries that these other structures want to create. So this was sort of the core issue that we had to wrestle with. How do you transition from this model here over to this distributed network model? And so we did that through what we call at the time shared consciousness. Basically, you need the entire organization to be thinking organically and sharing information in near real time around the entire globe. And so one of the ways we did this, and I just throw this as an example, we would have a daily synchronization meeting. Now imagine this. Because there were so many critical things going on the battlefield, we lived on a 24/7 24-hour cycle, because that's how fast Al-Qaeda would move and change on the battlefield. We did this 7 days a week for 5, 6, 7, 8 years on end, where we would start every morning with a 90-minute global video teleconference. So it started with a room about this number of people spread around the world, so maybe 100 or so. And for 90 minutes, you would connect and say, okay, what are you seeing, what are you seeing, what are you seeing, passing all this information. Over the years, and when I was on General Crystal's staff, as Marty referenced earlier, we had 7,000 to 8,000 people a day dialed into one single conversation from 26 countries, every time zone, all around the world, passing real-time information about what they were seeing in the fight. And that allowed us to understand, what's the current situation on the ground, what critical changes have taken place over the past 24 hours, what should we be doing, and most importantly, how well is this model working inside of our organization? Are there critical nodes that are shutting down? Are there people that aren't getting their voice heard in the conversation, etc.? And that allowed us to maintain this broad contextual understanding and to see how fast the Al-Qaeda network was shifting underneath us by getting real ground truth from a junior level operator who might really just be coming off a mission against a bunch of Al-Qaeda insurgents, and be able to step right into a forum like that at a very young age and report up to the most senior leaders really in the world fighting this fight and say, okay, here's what we just learned 10 minutes ago in this interaction with Al-Qaeda that I think matters to the entire globe. And they would just inject that into the conversation immediately. And so what you were able to do was take all these rooms and connect them and then in real time start affecting the operations, because that's what really matters in today's world. It's not how quickly can you connect senior leadership and how efficient can you be with your information flow. It's how effective are you at transitioning that back into action on the ground that actually matters against the reality of the fight you're in. Because if you're not moving this fast, a much less organized and much less trained fighter or organization can actually easily outmaneuver these traditional elements. So if you think about that, there's also a really interesting angle to all of this for you guys to think about, which is how do leaders need to change the way they think? So you're the next generation of leaders that's going to be running the show here. For us, this was a really important part of the change, because if you think about what it takes to be a leader at that senior sort of top dot in the hierarchy position in the old model, very different behavior than being able to get in front of 6,000, 7,000 people and looking out at a junior person coming out of a firefight and saying, okay, what do you think? What just happened? Cut through 10, 15 layers of bureaucracy, and I want your real-time feedback on what we're seeing out there. So leaders have to be comfortable transitioning from this sort of, leader on the horseback, Napoleon-style model where you just sort of raise the flags and the forces move around you, to a much more thoughtful, what we consider sort of the chess master approach of the old into a gardener approach of the new. So a pretty big shift there from, I'm going to sit up top, act like a chess master, act like I can understand the entire board, get feedback from folks on the ground, to realizing my job is no longer to be able to just understand all this information as it comes in. I need to, much like a gardener would raise love the bed of garden, the garden bed outside the building here. I need to set the conditions where the folks on my teams can grow into what they're naturally good at. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be constantly in there telling them what to do. A zucchini doesn't grow because you yell at it. Where 30 years ago, in the military, a junior person would do what they did because you told them to do it very directly. In today's environment, the role of leaders in the military, and what we're seeing in business as well, is to create the space where things that are going to happen naturally are allowed to evolve. And so giving people the room they need to create these networks, to hear what's going on the ground, and to come up with creative problem solving, which is ultimately what allowed us to get ahead of the fight against Al-Qaeda, was all of the folks that were closest to the problem having the freedom and autonomy to be able to connect with one another and say, okay, here's what I just learned based on this interaction with Al-Qaeda. Therefore, I'm going to give you this information or these resources, and you can go out and do the next thing before we have to ask anyone up here for permission, because we're informed enough to be able to do that without creating any problems for the bigger organization. And so the real takeaway here, and I'll stop. We can take some questions and go into some discussion. is this idea, efficiency to adaptability, problem set. This is really what we're seeing, what we saw in the military, and we're seeing in business. People getting their heads around this massive differentiation. It's starting to become more mainstream, and what I tell folks on the business side is this is going to solve itself naturally when folks of your generation are actually in the ranks of corporate America, because my sense is anyone below 25 thinks very naturally like this, but it's going to be a 10, 15-year journey for us to get there to really understand why this is happening. So that's the background. Now let's go to some questions. Thanks, by the way. Sir.
How did you become a Navy SEAL?
So the training to get into SEAL teams takes about a year and a half. It takes about a year and a half. So there's a few different entries, like with all the special operations communities. For the SEAL teams, you can enlist and pass certain tests to get into. There's certain basic physical standards. You can go through you can go through the Naval Academy for the SEAL teams. You can direct commission through a ROTC program, or you can apply to OCS, Officer Candidate School, after college if you haven't done any of those. I did the fourth. I went to University of Richmond and then applied to Officer Candidate School, was accepted there. With the follow-on assignment of going to BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL School out in Coronado, California, which is where the freezing cold water comes into play. The basic selection there is about a 7 to 8 month process, at which point we tend to lose about 80% of the folks. And then from there you go on to an advanced 6 month course, and you lose another, say, 20% or so in that. And then you go through a series of more advanced training like military free fall and all the fun stuff that you imagine you're going to do when you first start. But it actually takes a while to get there. And so after about an 18-month period, folks are ready to get their Trident, which is the warfare insignia of the SEAL teams. So they receive their Trident. That's the final marker to say, okay, you're officially part of the SEAL teams. And then they'll get their first set of orders to one of the teams. And we have 8 SEAL teams, 4 on the West Coast, 4 on the East Coast, and then an advanced underwater team out in Hawaii.
It seems the adaptive model seems a bit like organized chaos.
Mm-hmm.
How does the military rationalize that? I mean, you said you had a video conference with about 700 people or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
7,000 people or something like that. How do you possibly process everything that's going on at once?
Yeah, it's a great question. So how do you keep this from becoming organized chaos? So the alternative we saw was we're going to lose. So what we didn't have was a game plan. Nobody said, we figured it out. We need to go to this sort of model. What we said in 2003 was we are losing, and we're going to possibly, this will be beyond any chance of survival in about 12 to 16 months if we're calculating right. The good thing about the special operations community is it's limited resources. So you can sort of do the math and say, we're over deploying our forces, Al-Qaeda's growing. If we keep pushing ourselves any harder, literally we had like helicopters breaking down, we just couldn't get any more out of our forces or our equipment, we're going to lose this thing. So we got to do something different. And it started with the idea that we need more information flow. So we need more people to understand what's going on in real time. And so we just started iterating toward what was working. And the communication piece was really core to it. It's interesting, coming into this thing, what we underestimated, we collectively, like the U.S. in general, that had happened in the 90s was you'd always looked at military conflict as who's got the best trained soldiers, who has the best supply chains, who has, we had superior night vision, we had, incredible satellite systems, every sort of standard calculus you could come up with far exceeded the threat. What we underweighted, if you looked at this sort of a value prop between the two sides, was the commoditization of communication flow. Because in the 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever the case may be, as far back as you want to go, to set up a communication structure between someone sitting in Blairstown, New Jersey, and someone sitting in Iraq would be incredibly difficult. The barrier of entry there is sort of nation-state level, right? Now I have friends that are contractors in Baghdad, I could pick up the phone and call them. And it wouldn't be any more on my bill at the end of the month. That's a radical shift in how the world functions, which you guys are the natives to, right? But it's a huge mindset difference for us. So we realized, okay, we've got to be able to communicate as fast as this, because this is now level the battlefield, so to speak. And so there were periods where it felt chaotic, but because we grew into it organically, and now when we do this work with an industry, we know how to approach it. You have to start with really understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then you can cascade discussions and conversations down underneath that. And so it's not just everyone talking about what they think matters. It's informing people, here's what our strategy is, and for us that shifted pretty regularly, depending on what the threat was doing on the ground. But then I knew if I'm on the ground, I'm one of those people coming off a helicopter after a mission being asked, hey, give an update on what's going on in Baghdad. If I'm paying attention to the last 3, 4, 5 days of conversations, I'm going to know, okay, I've got 500 things I could talk about right now, but here are the 2 that the whole group needs to know about, because we're really worried about this northern part of Baghdad. And so I'm not going to bore you with 450 other data points. I'm going to go right to the 2 that I think matter to the organization. So you build in these human layers inside the network that actually become your filters and able to sort of get rid of the information. If you look at how militaries thought in World War II, for example, if you were that frontline, lieutenant on the front in World War II, you were looking for really big pieces of data. Where are the Germans? How many are there? Do they have tanks? What do the roads look like to get there? And then you can push all those big chunks of information up to a strategic headquarters, and they can do the math and say, okay, based on this, we really have to worry about this town or this flank, whatever the case may be, because there's only so many options. See, the model is built around being able to predict based on a knowable amount of information. On the modern battlefield, and the same thing in business or healthcare, wherever you want to look, you're flooded with data. You can't possibly do that. You can't ask one person to say, what are the 3 things that are going on? So what people do is default to their old behavior, which is, here's everything I'm seeing, and then it gets up to a certain level, and people are just overwhelmed with information. And so by inviting that many people to the conversation, you're able to create this awareness in and down into the organization and say, okay, here's what I can go back to that small chunks of data sort of mentality, and I know what to push out.
So we learned, you obviously talked a lot about how efficient the system is in the military, but when you switch over to businesses, say, how efficient is this new model, and what are some obstacles, I guess, that present themselves when you switch the environment?
It works really well in business, and we're not alone in this. There are other conversations going on in industry right around this sort of model right now. There's different approaches to it. Ours is based on what we learned overseas, obviously, but there are some business theorists that are trying to create just distributed model sort of networks inside of organizations, doing away with all rank structure and titles, those sorts of things. There are technology solutions that are sort of coming into play where you can, rather than depending on the org chart to create relationships and information flow and decision cycles like businesses normally do, you can actually see critical nodes through a tech sort of approach to how your organization actually runs. The big hurdles come from the mind shift, and this is why I think eventually we're just going to grow out of this, because you won't hire consultants like me. You'll just do this. But getting to the sort of middle and senior level thinkers that came up just like I did in the old system, and convincing them, A, that there really is a strategic level threat out there, and B, you're going to have to, that last portion, you're going to have to change how you think and act as a leader. That's always the biggest hurdle. What's interesting, and it was like this for us in the military, and then when you work in industry, you see the same thing. Anybody below 26 or something, somewhere in there, just says, yeah, of course, this just makes total sense. This is how we do things at the ground anyway. The senior level says, well, I want to be better, so I'm focused on this. It's always that mid-level that's sort of, that's where you are in your career, whatever space you go into, that you're sort of in charge of keeping the system working. And so it's the system thinkers right now that they'll be in that position collectively for another 10 to 15 years. And so I would argue within 4 years, organizations that have made some sort of shift like this, whether this model or other models that are out there, will start to show a significant competitive advantage, and that'll be the tipping point where industry really revolutionizes itself.
Do you believe that the application of special ops using this adaptive model would be effective against ISIS? Or would there have to be a much larger American policy shift?
I would, for non-attribution, I would say the policy shift is necessary because I guess we're starting to see a little bit of this. This takes momentum. So ISIS is, I'll back up. ISIS is Al-Qaeda 2.0, right? It's the same guys. They were in Baghdad, basically waiting for the next opportunity. The first 500 that showed up were all folks that we've been fighting with for the previous 10 years. I had friends in Syria at that point that were saying, "Hey, they're getting the band back together. It's all the same folks." And they've just been sort of laying low, waiting for the opportunity to evolve. And so, terrorist movements like that are, in some ways, like an illness. So you go to the doctor and you say, "I've got this, chest virus." So he gives you the antibiotics, and you take 2 weeks, and your doctor told you to take 3, but you feel better, and you stop taking the last week. And what happens? 3 weeks later, you get even sicker because some of the virus is still alive in your system, and when it comes back, it's even stronger because it's adapted. It's learned from the first regimen of penicillin you took, and now it doesn't react when you try to go back on your meds. Basically, that's what we're seeing in ISIS, where enough of it survived, and the nation states over top of it weren't secure enough to provide some sort of stability. So it saw its opportunity, it manifested, and it learned from Al-Qaeda 1.0 how to use social networks better, how to create a global following even faster. He grew from a few hundred fighters to 20 to 30,000 in a matter of 6 months. The world has never seen something like that before. And it's, I would argue, probably the new norm in these sorts of fights. And so, yeah, to go after something like ISIS, I don't know another way aside from aggressive, high level of operational cadence against them. We talk about working with host nation organizations to try to develop the capability, et cetera, et cetera. There's some long-term things that have to happen in there, but if you really you want to aggressively knock back their ability to continue expanding, it does require a more focused endeavor to get boots on the ground and a pretty regular cadence, and that's a major policy shift that the U.S. is going to feel.
Do you think that the reason why this adaptive method works so well for the Al-Qaeda or other terrorist group is because all the members have a firm belief in the same religion, and so when they're separated into individual teams, they all think similarly?
It's a great question. Yes and no. Not every Al-Qaeda fighter is as extreme of a religious hardliner as you might imagine. They have their spectrum as well. In some cases, yes. I mean, that's been critical for them. But you can take religion out of it and just say, is there a core idea? Networks really function around, is there a belief that we can latch onto? And so I might want to, start moving around blue sweater Sunday or whatever. If there's enough passion inside of that, I can develop a Twitter follower and a Facebook page, and everybody's now wearing blue sweaters on Sunday. It's probably not going to get that much momentum because the idea isn't that great, right? But if you have enough zealots inside of a space that are latching on to something that really matters inside of a particular window of history, which is why if you're looking at Al-Qaeda and ISIS and those things, the history goes back 100 years or beyond to really understand what's the arc of the narrative inside of those cultures that got them to the point where if you're a 21-year-old, fighting age man or woman, the best option in front of you, the one that's most appealing, is to go into, what's horrible conditions in a place like Syria, to align yourself with ISIS, to cut your life expectancy down to maybe 3 years, and it's going to be a pretty miserable 3 years. But at the end of the day, these are pretty rational people. I've met a lot of fighters from that side, and they're not crazies. They're making rational decisions based on the world they see around them, and the world they see around them is pretty rough. And when there are folks that understand all the flaws in that system, and can really manipulate it and use social media and other, sort of modern outlets to do so, they're able to scale up these movements very quickly. So it's more about, is the idea, think of it as a marketing campaign. Is the idea you're injecting well-timed and you have the right channels to reach the right audience? If so, you've got a pretty good competitive advantage in today's world. Sure.
How feasible, in your mind, is it to continue with this progression if the way to defeat this organization is an adaptive organization on our side, which means the soft world? Soft world is a limited capacity in just terms of numbers, so then you're tapping into the same operators time and time again. You're obviously burning out your operators, and then you either have to burn them out until they flash out, or you have to lower your standards in order to increase numbers. At some point, something breaks. What, in your mind, is the solution to that?
It's a great point. And special operations will not win these wars. And I think we're in a dangerous sort of period of our history where they become the easy button. Oh, I've got a problem and name the country, hit the special operations button, they'll go do something. They'll create momentum, and they will definitely go do something. But it's not going to, Syria isn't going to restabilize itself because you do enough missions. What special operations is really good at is buying the time and space for law and order to then come into the white space and reestablish itself. I think that was our significant miss in Iraq, going back a few years, where there's something in the counterterrorism world called a soft win. So there's a hard win, which is you've recreated a truly stable space where law and order, nation-state systems, democracy, whatever is going to be injected into that space, has time to grow and foster. And the person on the street believes in that more than they believe in the horrible alternative of going and fighting for ISIS. So that's a hard one. I think what we saw in Iraq, and there's a long history of this inside of counter-terrorist, insurgent movements, is a soft win, which is it looks like you did that, but you didn't keep the pressure on long enough for those rules and governance to really take over. So when you back out, the man on the street is suddenly now looking down the barrel of the same Al-Qaeda fighter that was there before you left 18 months ago, and they say, wait a second, this isn't what I bargained for. You clearly didn't establish rule of law here. You just sort of tampered the sickness for 3, 4, 5 years, however long it may have been, and then you left, and this person still lives around the corner. And so now we're re-engaged in this problem. So that's why these things take a long time, and why it involves policy, and the U.S. is tired of it, and it's a big question. So like going into Syria isn't just a question of, should we increase the op tempo for 18 months? The question is this enough of a geopolitical threat that we want to re-engage and be there for 10, 12 years at significant tempo with a significant amount of cost? What are the alternatives on the backside of that? That's the type of conversation that I don't see us having sort of the time horizon or patience to have these days. But we're good at sort of early rhetoric. We're good at phase 1, which is go in there and just start doing stuff. But phase 3, 4, 5, beyond the long-term planning stuff, we've shown the world now that we're not really interested in doing that. So I do believe, an extension of Marty's question, before you commit to that stuff, you have to say, okay, but what's the stay-behind plan? Are we willing to commit to this thing for a generation, perhaps? If the answer is no, then you have to weigh the risk on the backside. Sir?
What kind of companies have you seen or do you see that would benefit the most from this type of corporate change, to increase growth and profits?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've worked everywhere from technology to consumer goods to banking, healthcare, oil and gas. So I would argue, every big enough sort of enterprise is feeling some sort of pressure like this. Where we found it most immediately applicable are organizations that have sort of geographic distribution issues. So if you have a model where you might be big, but everybody's in the same building in New York, and you sort of I'll give you an example. Like when we first started working in banking, we started at the sort of the trader desk level, which is, it's fast-paced environment. We figured there's got to be some resonance with this sort of thinking. But we really dug into it. So yeah, it's a hectic position, but it's pretty binary. You've got a bunch of people in the same room. making trades back and forth. It wasn't until we brought it up the next level and said, okay, who are the people that are looking at the risk inside of trading on a global scale that you can really step to say, okay, are the systems in place to be able to correctly inform, monitor, deal with regulation input, et cetera, at the trader level where you're actually making the money. And that's their version of going out on targets, right? So that sort of geographic distribution problem is one that we tend to really latch onto. And then things like supply chains and whatnot, where you have, if you go back to 100 years, where they're nice linear sort of lines of effort inside a major organization. Supply chain's a great one because it's so impacted by what's going on around the world now that we work with a lot of chief supply chain officers, and they deal with C-suite who still thinks that supply chain is, make it here, ship it through that, get it to this port, and we'll sell it at a store. And the real thinkers inside supply chains now are saying, well, the port that we just ship it out of just got blown up, or this entire region where our main factories are being built is being disrupted by weather patterns that didn't exist 10 years ago, or insurgent movements that are going to overthrow the government. And there's been pockets of that in history, obviously, but it's now this global supply chains are being bombarded by this sort of problem set on a pretty regular cadence. And so that's another big area where this sort of thinking applies. In regulatory issues, I mean, it's a huge space because there's the external environment is hitting organizations so much faster than they're normally used to dealing with. In technology, the big narrative is we've got the two-person startup in a garage that go back 15, 20 years. You could see it coming because it had to make itself known before it could do anything really strategically. Now it can stay very small, very, very quiet and get huge, and then turn the lights on, and suddenly you've got this disruptive app or new sort of tech movement that's disrupting a huge player like an Apple or an HP or something like that. So there's a different narrative in every space, but the ones that are big enough and have this sort of global reach are all feeling some version.
How does something like this new network way of thinking in the military affect military funding and spending?
That's a good question. Never got that. Well, I tell you what I think it's going to do is most people don't get this in the military. Everyone got it very intensely for about 10 years, and this is an attack on people. The military is it's a systems design, right? And so what it's going to do, and you can feel it as these conflicts started cycle down. By that I mean like Iraq's ending, Afghanistan's ending. Special operations community is still working at a really high outtempo. But these other systems are going to revert back into traditional funding lines. So go back in the middle of the peak of the war in Iraq. Military planners could go to Congress and say, I need X. And they would say, you got it. We know we're losing a war, so whatever you say is going to work, you got it. Well, now there's not that sort of burning platform on the military side. And so congressional planners say, well, it's really hard to just give you everything you want. Why don't you give me a 20-year spend plan so that we can build the next bomber or the next type of aircraft carrier? And that's a really nice, tight package that I can take back to my district and create jobs, and I can put a 20-year funding plan in place, and all these other things that are really nice linear processes. That's where the systems themselves between the military and elected officials really want to get back to that sort of status quo. And so we run the risk of saying, but what we really need is a constantly shifting linguist program, because we don't know where the next fight's going to be. So I need an open funding stream where I can constantly be developing language skills inside of my force. Or I don't need aircraft carriers. I need an ever-shifting fleet of very small, fast boats that I can put on aircraft and deploy around the world in real time. And I don't know what they're going to look like next year or maybe even next month. But I need sort of open, and the value is going to be much cheaper than an aircraft carrier, but I need it in sporadic chunks over the next 10 years perhaps. That confuses big systems that say, well, I can't do that. I need you to spend $10 billion a month forever on program X. Come back to me when you have that. So I think we run the risk of reverting back to that norm, and then when the next thing blows up, you're going to relearn a lot of these lessons.
Do you think some of organizations function better inherently within a hierarchical structure?
Yes, depends on, I would argue now that the simpler the output, the more benefit you can get from a hierarchical structure. If I was running a hair cuttery, I'd probably make it top down, like everyone has hair, everyone needs haircuts, and it's pretty, I want to optimize that process. No offense to any barbers in the room, but the more complex the system gets, the more we have to move away from that. And what we actually advocate, what we really became, was much more of a hybrid system where we didn't do away with the org chart. We still had that organizational structure, but we had layered into it these sub-networks that had the autonomy to shift organically against the problem as it evolved.
I have another question. Could you give us a specific example of a victory in Iraq that can be attributed to this new adaptability that actually happened? Some particular...
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was sort of there were 10 a night, but so that image I showed earlier, that was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. You never heard of him? He was the sort of kingpin leader of Iraq for about a 2 or 3 year stretch. He was Jordanian by birth and he was one of these agitators inside the network, extremely passionate, charismatic in his own sort of weird way, and able to, his mission in life, his stated mission was to create the civil war between the Sunni and the Shia in Iraq. So he was slaughtering people on both sides in order to create total chaos into which he could then push this sort of traditional ideology that he believed in. So we spent years and years chasing him and his cohorts down. A specific success that led to that, the first one, I would argue in a chain of events that eventually got us to him was a troop of operators that were on a daytime mission. They were on a helicopter, they hit a target, turned out to be not, the person they were looking for wasn't there, so they rally up, hop back in the helicopters, they're flying back to base, and as they're, a guy I know well is sitting in the door of the helicopter, sort of relaxing, thinking about what they just did, and he spots out of the corner of his eye a vehicle pattern that looked suspicious to him. So there's, if you pay enough time looking at, overhead predator shots of the way that Al-Qaeda and these insurgent groups sort of move their vehicles, there are sometimes distinct patterns because they're worried about security and whatnot. So he saw in the corner of his eye what he thought was a vehicle swap. So if I think I'm being followed, this isn't state secret, by the way, I'm going to pull my car over, have you meet with me with your car, I'm going to get in your car and take off. I might do that 2 or 3 times before I get to my final destination to have a secret meeting or whatever the case may be. And it's a way to confuse intelligence folks that might be trying to watch me. And so a friend of mine sees what he thinks is a vehicle swap out of the corner of his eye. They were flying low on the horizon, daytime, and whoever it was wasn't paying close enough attention to realize there might be somebody watching. So he makes a call on the spot, says, hey, while you're here for a second, they watch what the vehicle's doing. He goes, yeah, that was a vehicle swap. And he makes the call on the scene. So he has enough awareness of where he is on the battlefield, the type of thing he's looking for out there, and has the authority at his level, which is a very junior level, to shift all these assets in real time. Calls 2 missions to go. One helicopter, he splits his helicopters, which is a non-standard practice that he had the authority to do. They chase down both vehicles, detain personnel on both the cars, bring them back to base, and one of them turns out to be one of the senior communicators that work for Zarqawi, and you can follow a linear series of events over the next few months that eventually got us to that. So that's sort of independent, on-the-ground thinking that in a traditional system, the system would have said, that's great, Bob, come back to base, tell us what you just saw, and we'll flood some intelligence assets over that area and see what we can come up with. What they would have come up with was nothing, because by that point the opportunity would have moved on.
One more, maybe last question.
Very different. We know there are differences by gender in terms of how people learn and communicate. Is corporate America looking at all at how, by gender, people have facility or comfort with the organic model as they teach people in these positions to use it?
Yeah, no, it's not big of a conversation yet, but you're exactly right. So what worked for us was a shift, and this is what we espouse to corporate leaders, is If you think you're gonna just barrel chest your way through this, you're missing the point. This is all about soft skills. You don't get in front of 7,000 people dealing with life and death situations and start yelling and screaming and saying, you know, what's going on? You're wrong. That's messed up. Because people will just, we're all, you know, fifth graders at the end of the day. Like, people will revert back into their safe space, not say anything because nobody wants to get yelled at or be embarrassed. It's only the soft-skilled leaders that have the ability to draw out the real meaning and create a safe environment where people can speak their mind and not get their head cut off for it. And if you can create a corporate or wherever you are, a culture where people are allowed to do that, and it's really a matter of leaders that have, I put empathy at the top of my list. The more complex the environment, the more empathy senior leaders need to have to really understand you are dealing with a very hard problem. I'm sort of sitting in my comfortable office, and I'm asking you to provide me ground truth. And if it's ugly truth, if you don't know all of it, if it turns out it's inaccurate tomorrow, but you're doing the best you can, I need to empathize with the fact that you're seeing 1,000 new data points every day. And so give you a space where you can report that up to the group and we can learn collectively. We still see more of the former than the latter, but I do think there's an awareness evolving that this is what's going to have to take place inside of on the leadership behavior side for industry to survive in the next 20 years.
Okay, thank you very much.